Cyanotype, written by Ivan Rabbit, corrected by Andrew Lucas and Mitch Britton. I learned about cyanotype at a fairly early age. At that time I think I was an 11 or 12 years old boy. I liked chemistry very much, and I tried to carry out some experiments in my apartment. Of course, my parents were not always very happy with my activity. They were afraid that I would blow up our flat or explode something in the kitchen. By the way, I understand their fears because now I have children too. I remember that I had a really big dream to make a big explosion in the yard of our house. I think at that time a large amount of the Soviet children had the same idea. Not all children could build something to explode, but I can say that most of them wanted to do it. I really liked chemistry, and I had thoughts of being a chemist and worked all my life in that area. In that time there was no internet, but there were some interesting science channels where it was possible to find a lot of interesting details about chemical experiments. Also, I had another idea. I wanted to build a small rocket. My parents knew about it, and I think that this idea terrified them. Launched at a height of 200–300 meters so that a special small camera could take a photo of me. At least I remember puzzlement in the eyes of my father. He had seen small head fairings, which I made from wood from my revolutionary rockets. Do you know what my main problem was? I didn't have reagents for my activity. I had some books with good description of experiments, but where is it possible to get concentrated sulfuric acid or concentrated nitric acid for an ordinary Soviet boy, 11 or 12 years old? I remember that thought eventually turned in my head. For some experiments it's possible to buy some pills in drug stores, but there was a problem too. It was difficult. Some pills, for example calcium gluconate, were possible to buy without problem. But if I asked the drug seller, please give me hydrogen peroxide and potassium manganese, I could be asked, why do you need it? Where are your parents? I don't sell this drug to you, go away. But I could go around several pharmacies, and sometimes I got lucky. I adapted to this situation, and I learned to buy some essences separately, so that each seller could not understand what I am going to do with them later. Do you know what would happen if hydrogen peroxide and potassium manganese would mix? It is a fine chemical reaction that begins with a large amount of gas, and if you put this mix in a bottle and close the cap, what will it be? Yes, a big explosion will happen and your bottle will break. At that time it was a good entertainment for children who didn't know anything about the internet. The second place where it was possible to get some good reagents was a shop for home, but I had the same problem there. I could buy soap or brush for dust without problems, but a fat woman at the checkout refused to sell me 1 liter 25% ammonia or 2 liters hydrochloric acid. It was very offensive. As you can see, I felt a very strong desire for science and knowledge. But there is a third place too. There were shops for gardeners. It was a marvelous place with huge queues, evil sellers, and a lot of buyers with crazy eyes. And there it was possible to buy marvelous things, for example, sulfur smoker, copper sulfate, ferrous sulfate, potassium nitrate, and so on. Also, in that time there was a strange system for buying. You must give money in one place and take a paper check, but take the product in another place. And because anywhere there are queues, some parents put their children in a queue and themselves stood in another. I had heard that this shop was always crowded, and this idea lived up to its reputation. When I first came to this shop, it was not far from me, only 2 underground stations from my apartment. I felt that I was in a can with heroin. If parents came with their children, it was popular to ask children to stand in the queue where the goods were issued, when the parent was in the other queue. In this case, children did not deal with money, and likelihood that he will be cheated with money at the checkout will be less. If you ask me how frequently children were victims by cheating from the side sellers, I can say yes, sometimes it occurred. I remember these cases. In the Soviet Union, shop workers had a bad reputation. Well, what's about my idea of buying substances? It's a good idea for me, isn't it? There were always a lot of people, so I could pretend that I came with my parents. I spent a lot of time standing in the queue, but I bought two marvelous essences: sulfur in the form of sulfur smokers and potassium nitrate. If you add to them finely ground coal, you will get a black gunpowder. It means I have fuel for my rockets. It was a pretty purchase of my childhood. 2 kilograms potassium nitrate and 1 kilograms sulfur. It was happiness or almost sky grace for me. I can't describe it in words. Oh, if you ask what it will be if the seller refuses to give me goods, I can answer. Other people would get upset because I would stall the queue. Here is a funny moment when I bought 2 components for gunpowder simultaneously. Also, there was fourth place too. There were shops for amateur photographers. It was a good place too, and the main advantage was that I could buy everything without problems, because people believed that photography was a fine hobby for Soviet children. In that time I could buy dangerous substances without questions. If you want the chemical kit for color photo, no problem. This kit contained cyanide, approximately 10-15 grams. I think Agatha Christie would be gladdened by this fact. A set of sulfate salts, 2 or 3 kilograms, without questions. A set of hydroquinone, 0.5 kilograms. Please, take it, don't spill it. I remember that I buy a lot of other good devices. For example, a beautiful thermometer with a fascinating blue liquid or finely magnified glass. My parents saw my activity in the chemical area and attempted to send me in a more peaceful direction. And they didn't know about my hidden chemical treasures. I don't know what they would say if they know that their child saves under the bed a couple kilograms of the components of gunpowder, which he intends to use as a rocket fuel. In any case, they came up with the idea that I need to buy a very fine set for young chemists. What it was you can see in the photos. The price of that set was for about 10 rubles. USSR rubles, of course. Yeah, it was a fine gift for me. This set was produced in DDR, Deutschland Democratic Republic. In the small book were descriptions of 145 experiments, and for every one there were needed substances. Also formulas for chemical reactions were written. This information helped me a lot years later. When I was already studying at the university. I knew about some chemical reactions from my experience, not only by using dry paper formulas and textbooks. I felt ideas and I knew about some problems which can appear. For example, I spent a lot of time trying to produce sulfuric acid. Please don't ask me why I need it. It was a simple and interesting idea to check my possibilities. In that chemical textbook it was written that at the first step I must produce sulfur oxide and later oxidize it more so that sulfur was connected to the oxygen in a difference valence. It's very simple to read in the book, but difficult to realize in reality. In an incomprehensible way I bought small pieces of sulfur with stones. It was a very difficult task. But I found a way and I exchanged them with my schoolmate who had them as a part of his mineral collection. I gave him a light diodes. I have a dozen, and at that time it was a rare and expensive. But he gave me small pieces of sulfur which were included in the stones. I remember a special smell which had these small stones with sulfur. I take pieces of a real sulfur. I remember that real sulfur has a yellow color. The smell of sulfur. Do you remember where it's written about too? But the Bible story we will not touch here. If you think that you have pieces of sulfur and produce a sulfur acid is a simple deal, it's not true. Absolutely. You can carry out a small experiment in the probe with sulfur by gradually heating, and you can see the gradual transformation of sulfur oxide to the other forms. The last step in transformation process is recognized is very simple. Sulfur oxide, where sulfur is in the needed valence, to look like fog. At this moment you need to dissolve it in the water and your sulfur acid is ready. In probe transformation went without problems, and for it you don't need to use other substances or physical condition experiments. But if you will produce more quantities of sulfur acid, you need to assemble some complex devices. At least this complex process must be divided into 5 stages. In the first part you need to heat sulfur minerals. In the second part you need to clear gas of sulfur oxide. In the third part you need to transform one form of sulfur oxide to another one. At this level you need to use an additional substance. It's a catalyst for transformation. And in the last stage you need to dissolve sulfur oxide in the water. And I was broken on the last level. I assembled the device according to the picture in the textbook, but I had a big problems with rubber corks. I didn't have enough corks. What did I do? I took corks for wine bottles I found in the yard of my house. They were made from cork trees. For sealing I used paraffin. It was a terrible mistake. Why? Because when I began to heat pieces of sulfur mineral, and when sulfur oxide was gone, other chemical reactions occurred. Paraffin with sulfur gave me a lot of hydrogen sulfide. It was a terrible stink of rotten eggs. And the big problem was that I couldn't stop that process immediately. Because it was difficult to come to the kitchen. I felt terrible nausea. But I did it. I took away the flame from under the first part of my chemical complex and opened the window. Also, I heard that my neighbors began to complain that again that stinky garbage truck goes through our yard. At that moment I was very afraid that they would find out the real source of the stench and told my parents what I did. But it's obvious the scale of my experiments was not big, and the fate quickly disappeared. But the impression I have for my whole life. The smell of hydrogen sulfur I will remember all my life. Even now I felt very nauseous while writing this. It was terrible. Also, in those experiments I had to use catalysts for the transformation of sulfur oxide. According to the recommendation in the book, I had to use pieces of clay pottery with the remains of some iron salt. Here I needed some substance, in this case it was iron, which is possible to interact with sulfur. After some years I understand that in this level I made mistakes too, because I gave a small amount of heat in this level of chemical complex and the reaction of transformation of oxide sulfur would not occur. Process chemical reactions were very interesting for me, and I can't explain why. I took a chemistry textbook, began to read, and when I read the description of the experiments, a strange wish appeared in my mind. At that moment I clearly understood I must do it. As people said in the Russia for this situation, I felt an itch in my ass. I came up with a new idea for an experiment, and my life became saturated and interesting. In other words, I can say that I didn't chase some material interest, to trade something for money and so on. An experiment was interesting in itself. I was very glad when I could achieve results which I believed. It was a real happiness for me. Also, I didn't have a system for experiments. I took an idea from any place in a chemistry textbook and I began to realize it. And once upon a time I found a description of alternative methods for producing photos. I remember that there was some process described, but my attention was attracted by experiments with the cyanotyping process. If you ask me why, I can't answer now. I have essence for this. For the cyanotype process, you need two substances, ferric ammonium citrate and potassium ferricyanide. I had a big quantity of the second one because I bought in the shop for a photo. And yes, this toxic substance I bought when I was 11 years old. I don't describe here what you need to do to take a real toxic substance from this one. I can say that it's possible only. But I didn't have a second substance. But by reading two chemistry textbooks and finding out that I can get in by other chemical processes, wow, I was captured by this idea. At that moment I had a set for young chemists, and there were a lot of interesting substances. I remember that I used potassium ferrocyanide and sodium hydroxide for producing iron hydroxide, which I took from this set. Also, I remember that I must make a transformation with iron hydroxide to change the valence of iron. And in the last level of my reactions, I took citric acid and ammonia. Ammonia I bought in the shop hardware store. I don't remember exactly what I did, but I can make ferric ammonium citrate. I remember that it was a solution with a yellow-green color, which had a specific smell. Do you know where to use this substance now? It's a popular food additive now. And when I come to the bread section of grocery, I feel that smell from my childhood. Producers add this substance to bread to keep it fresh. Because the process of chemical transformation was long, I thought I could make mistakes. Of course my chemical experiments are unsuccessful very frequently, and I was ready for this case too, I thought. But I decided to carry out my idea with cyanotype. I mixed a solution of ferric ammonium citrate with potassium ferricyanide. As a result, I got a dark green solution, which I painted on the back side of my old pictures, and I left them in the bathroom to dry in darkness. While I washed props and struggle pans on the kitchen table, my parents didn't see this. My miracle paper was dried because I sat in the towel dryer. I held two carved paper sheets with yellow paint. I can't say that it looked beautiful. At that time the sunlight appeared on the owl balcony and I managed to put some objects. I remember that among them were scissors, pen, a small plant leaf which I cut from my mother's room flower. The sheet with objects was lying for about 5 to 6 minutes while the sun disappeared in the sky, and I again thought that it was bad and that the result would be 0. I took the sheet and went to the bathroom to wash it. When I turned on the water tap and began to sweep the yellow dye, I was shocked. I see an intense blue color. It was a real surprise for me, and I hadn't thought that it would look like this, and yeah, I saw outlines of those very objects. At that moment I looked and I couldn't believe that I succeeded. Now I'm very sad that I didn't save those cyanotype sheets with the first experiments. And what happened next? I don't remember. I began some other activity the following day, but my brain made a notch in the consciousness that it maybe might work. Many years have passed since then. I graduated from my university, married my wife, our first child appeared, and once upon a time an old idea arose in my head. I told my wife about it, and we decided to try the process again. Now there is not a problem with buying substances. Now it's possible to do so in the food additive shops. Ferric ammonium citrate code is E381, but potassium ferricyanide code is E536. Also, they are possible to buy in the special chemist shops. For my case, I need to buy one component. It's ferric ammonium citrate, because I have other substances from old times. Do you think I threw away my stock of chemical reagents? No, I saved them for future generations. I made solution and painted thick papers, and we carry out the first experiments. Also, I use an old photo camera, Moskva 5, which can work with white films. This camera produced a film negative image with dimensions 6-9 centimeters. It's a really big dimensions, and I had an idea to transmit film images to self-made cyanotype papers. Also, I made UV lamp which could replace the sun. In Russia, the sun doesn't appear very frequently, especially in winters, and this lamp is very useful for cyanotype arts. Our last results you can see now. Of course they are very simple, but we like them. Oh, it's another our result. Now I simply use other techniques for cyanotype. You can take a photo with your smartphone, then make a negative image by any graphic software. I used GIMP. And print ready negative by transparent films for following contact transmitted to self-made cyanotype paper. Example ready photo you can see too. Also, I found some examples on the internet. Links to the sources I pointed to. This picture was taken here. Tone cyanotype with description of process toning. Details you can find here. Well, and after all that written and said, what are my ideas for the future? I can say it shortly. I have ideas, but I haven't time. Light sensitivity of cyanotype is low if compared with classic silver photo process. It brings most limitation for using this method, and it's the main disadvantage. My main idea was by using self-made paper and making a projection for some image to one. Now it's possible to realize by a small tweak ordinary light diode projector. In this case, the source of light might be changed to power a UV diode or lamp. For this approach, one problem remains. Since the wavelength of ultraviolet light is such that it must be taken into account when focusing, since the optics were designed for white light. Considering that the video matrix in the projector is at the same distance from the lens, the correction will be a constant value. It's good information for modification. Of course, it would be very tempting to immediately project the image onto photographic paper, but in this case you will get a negative image, which is not very good. For all cases we have yet a possibilities to use the toning process for your cyanotypes, and it's simple to make too. Many people use tear for this purpose, especially tear which is made from small bags, because in the last case special dye was added to the gunpowder tea dust in the bag. Do you know about this? You can put any tear bag in cold water and compare it with tear was put in hot water, and in most cases the color of your drink will be the same. It's strange, isn't it? This experiment demonstrates to us that there is a lot of dye in tear bags, of course. However, here I have to say that the chemical mechanic process of toning is not only by dye. And I think that tear bag with intense brown color is not the main idea for this. Do you remember that our cyanotype consists of blue salts of iron? We need some substance which could cause a chemical reaction with them. An idea is lying on the surface. Many years ago people made inks by themselves. For this it is possible to use any raw plant materials containing tannins. It might be oak bark, pomegranate peel, ink nuts, and so on. Of course there is a large amount of tannins in black tea. Most raw plant materials with tannins have a bitter taste, and so decoction can be tried with any plants which have a bitter taste. Of course, not all bitter plants have tannins, but they can be tried. To produce ink, the plant's part need to be decocted, and potassium ferrocyanide must be added. If the decoction contains tannins, the color of one will change to brown-black. This is a good approach for the production of self-made inks. By this method, the quality of solution for cyanotype tannin can also be checked. If a brown-black color is produced, then it will work with the cyanotype. A classic method for cyanotype tannin is using two steps or two solutions. The first is a weak water solution of ammonia. And the second solution with tannins. Tea can be used or tannins can be bought as ready-to-use substances in chemical reactive stores. Only the second solution can be used, but the first will possibility change the tone of cyanotype to a dark red color. A long treatment, more than 10 minutes, decreases the density of the cyanotype. This is because ammonia will react with the blue dye which created the cyanotype picture and generated some intermediate substance, and hence the end result photo will look like sepia. This is because ammonia will react with the blue dye which created the cyanotype picture and generated some intermediate substance, and hence the end result photo will look like sepia. If transforming the cyanotype to sepia is preferred, then ammonia should be added. I also have other ideas. For example, is it possible to make some combination cyanotype photo and your painting? For example, is it possible to make some combination cyanotype photos and your painting? The cyanotype is a quick process for creating object forms, and you could use some colors line or drawing to attract the attention of spectators. If somebody offers to make dyes for these pictures by themselves, I would think that it is an interesting idea, and I also have some experience in this area, because when I was child I also tried to make watercolor dyes by myself, but the result was not good. But I think this is a theme for another essay. Thank you for reading.